Hi, I'm Naima and I'm here to talk to you all about Black literature. So first I wanted to start off by saying we have always been storytellers. Going back to our various tribes and nations in Africa, and that has always been a huge part of our culture and the way that we share history, the way that we talk about lessons and morals, the way that we learn. Here as Black Americans, we have confronted some barriers in being able to tell our stories and have our stories be heard. So that goes back to the sort of start of this country, right? Being brought to this country as enslaved people, it was actually illegal for Black people to learn how to read and write. Being able to turn our oral narratives into stories on the page was difficult, as you can imagine. But despite that, we did, right? And thinking about some of the slave narratives you might have heard about from Harriet Tubman, we use these stories not only to talk about the injustices that our people have experienced, but also to pave a road towards freedom. What that means is that we use our stories not only to give our readers pleasure, right? Reading can be fun, but also to connect to cultural and political and other artistic movements that are going on in the country. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about our history in literature. I mentioned slave narratives, but we also have some really amazing writers from different eras throughout the history of our country. So first, I'd love to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. Some of you might have heard of that. It was an artistic revival, right? So slavery had ended, Reconstruction had started. It was still really hard for Black people to have their voices heard, appreciated, and for big publishers to include them in their libraries, right? And so the Harlem Renaissance, it focused on telling our stories in a way that really reflected the truth of our lived experience. So the richness, the joy, and yes, the pain, but it rejected the idea that Black experience was one thing, right? Which is what it was sort of fighting against in our modern culture. We often, at that point in the turn of the century, saw really negative stereotypes of what it was like to be Black. And these authors, like Langston Hughes, who wrote that the time was allowed for him to courageously and bravely tell the stories of our people without fear or shame. Zora Neale Hurston, who got to travel the country and collect some of those oral histories that I was talking about earlier. We have times like the Black arts movement. So the Black arts movement was born out of the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s. And in the 60s and 70s, Black writers and artists said, integration is really important. Being thought of as being equal is really important, but also it's very, very important for us to create spaces where if we don't have a seat at the table, we build our own table. And so those writers used literature as a way to build narratives about Black people that were, for us and by us, and controlling the narrative and enjoying and spreading Black pride and joy. Thinking about our modern Black literature, where are we going? What do we have to look forward to? I think what's really beautiful about Black literature is that it's ever evolving. So there isn't one thing that we like to write about or one story that we like to tell. One of my favorite writers who writes young adult fiction, so fiction for you, I encourage you to check her out. Her name is Elizabeth Acevedo, and she is an Afro-Latina Dominican writer. She was an English school teacher, and she taught the 8th grade. And she asked one of her students who was struggling a lot to get his reading assignments done. She said, "Why are you not interested in reading?" And he said, "Miss Acevedo, it's because these stories have nothing to do with us and they don't care about us," right? The characters were not reflective of this person's lived experience. She decided to write stories, for example, The Poet X, which is a novel, but it's written in verse, so it is a sort of hybrid of poetry and prose about teenage Black experience. And she's continued to write books about that, and they've been bestsellers and won National Book Awards, and so it's really exciting to see new Black literature be celebrated and accepted. The lesson that I would love for you guys to take away in thinking about Black lit is not everybody's gonna be a writer, right? We all have our different hobbies and interests, but that Black literature allows for us to see the things that we're passionate about can lead us to advocating for the freedom of our people, and also gives us opportunities to build worlds that we want to see, right? So it doesn't have to be about what's happening right now, but we get to imagine futures in which our lives are wildly beautiful and brilliant, right? And I encourage you all to focus on that, right? Your stories matter, your voices matter. And whether it's writing or reading or working on a science project or, you know, dreaming of becoming a lawyer, you have the opportunities in those communities to use the lessons of Black literature to build a better future.